Hello, this is BBC World News. I'm Newscaster. The headlines. The EU has defended its latest round of sanctions against Russia, but Ukraine says they didn't go far enough. The bloc agreed to cut oil imports from Russia by 90% by the end of the year. As the fighting continues, Russian forces are said to have taken control of about half of Severodonetsk, the last major city in the Luhansk region, still in Ukrainian hands. But Ukrainian defenders are still holding on. The Canadian government has introduced tough new gun control legislation, banning the sale of handguns and limiting magazine rifles to 5 rounds. Canada's gun homicide rate is less than a fifth of that in the US. And Taiwan says it's deployed fighter jets to ward off 30 warplanes sent by China into its air defence zone, the biggest incursion since January.
Now on BBC World News, the latest business news from across the globe. World Business Report.
As Europe announces a partial embargo on Russian oil, inflation on the continent hits an all-time high, deepening the cost of living crisis. And travel chaos on both sides of the Atlantic. Thousands of flights are cancelled or delayed as airlines struggle to meet surging demand. Hello, I'm Ben Boulos. Welcome to World Business Report. In just a moment, we'll have the latest economic growth figures from India. But before that, as you've been hearing today, European leaders have agreed on a partial ban on Russian oil, blocking around 2/3 of imports to try to cut off financing for the Russian war machine. The move is expected to add to already soaring inflation in Europe. Just a couple of hours ago, figures out from the European Union show that inflation has hit an all-time high. There it is, of 8.1%, and that is more than analysts were expecting. Record high prices are mainly being driven by the war and associated supply chain issues, all of which is worsening Europe's cost of living crisis. So how much worse can it get? Well, joining us to help answer that question, Mark Ostwald, Chief Economist and Global Strategist at ADM Investor Services International. Mark, given what we've seen the European Union agree today in respect of Russian oil imports, what sort of an impact do we think that might have on price inflation?
Well, unfortunately, energy is sort of the lifeblood of everything, including other commodities, the supply of other commodities. So this is going to have a knock-on effect. And the biggest knock-on effect is the fact that we've had high inflation for quite a long time, and particularly high raw materials and energy price pressures for quite some time. And there is a period of time for which people who manufacture things and service companies can absorb those, but after a while they basically have to pass those price increases on, and this basically creates more pressure going forward. So inflation isn't going to be coming down in any great hurry, and with energy prices likely to stay high because of this embargo, even if it isn't as perfect as certain people would want from a political standpoint, it's still going to create a lot more problems in the energy sector.
Mark, if I were a governor of a central bank right now, I'd be scratching my head thinking to myself, what do we do about inflation? Because interest rates have gone up, but if at the same time the prices for energy are going up, it almost potentially wipes out the effect of the interest rate rises on inflation, does it not?
It certainly does. I mean, I think part of the problem here is what we're dealing with is supply side inflation, i.e. the supply of goods and raw materials, rather than demand side, for which raising interest rates is generally much more effective. You can't really deal with a supply side problem where there is scarcity of energy supplies, of food supplies. With interest rate rises, you will to some extent, but the people who it will hit are the poorest. And therefore, for the central banks, there is a need to tread actually very, very carefully, because at some point you could actually create more problems than you care to think of.
In which case, I mean, this would have been unthinkable to suggest, not that long ago. Do you think we might be in a situation where governments or international organisations may have to intervene and put some kind of price intervention, some kind of price cap on oil, or would that not be feasible at all?
Well, you can't really cap the price of oil, but you certainly can introduce measures like reduction of energy taxes, even if that goes against the sentiment of the current era in terms of moving towards renewables, but that's a different issue. You can also make sure that in terms of preparing for the future, which we haven't been, because oil and gas investment upstream has been very, very low, about half what it was in the 2017-2021 period compared with 2011-16. You can incentivize that, but the rewards for that are much more longer term, because you can't build all the capacity that you need in a very great hurry. So in the short term, really, it is a case of subsidies, tax cuts to specific areas, which will help to ease some of the burden, but not all of the burden.
Indeed, it is something of an economics Rubik's Cube. Mark, thank you very much for speaking to us. Mark Ostwald there. Well, travellers around the world have faced chaos this week. You may well be one of them. Thousands of flights have been cancelled or delayed amid public holidays in the US and the UK. Demand for travel has jumped since pandemic restrictions were eased, but airlines are struggling to keep up due to staff shortages. Let's speak now to our New York business correspondent, Michelle Fleury. Michelle, do you think the airlines can get on top of this before we get into the midst of, certainly the Northern Hemisphere, the peak summer holiday season?
Look, I think they've got a real challenge ahead. You've got too few pilots. That's leading to fewer flights at a time when demand after sort of pandemic lockdowns is leading to a kind of rebound in interest in travel by plane. And then we haven't even got to the higher cost of jet fuel. But going back to that pilot shortage, I think major airlines are hoping to add 12,000 pilot jobs this year alone. It's one of the sort of biggest recruiting drives in a long time. A lot of this is because during the pandemic they let go workers, some retired early, there was a slowdown in training. So now they're desperately trying to ramp up, particularly regional airlines. Some have suggested reducing the number of flight hour requirements before joining a US carrier. You've got Delta Airlines and other big carriers dropping their requirement for a 4-year degree for pilot hiring requirements. So it's a pretty dire situation, and it's not one that you can solve overnight. So travellers are being warned to expect a kind of bumpy ride over the summer holiday, and we've seen that just this past weekend, the holiday weekend here, Memorial Day weekend, where more than 6,000 flights got cancelled, and so a lot of frustrated holidaymakers.
And what about this rising cost of oil? How's that affecting the airlines?
Yeah, I mean, this is another, headache, as if the pilot shortage wasn't enough. They're grappling with jet fuel, which has doubled in price. And you see the knock-on effect. It's not just a headache for airlines, it's also a headache for those who wish to travel by plane. The most recent inflation data, Ben, showed that airfares actually jumped 33% compared to a year earlier. So they're passing on costs. And it's interesting, when you break it down, like I said, jet fuel is double what it was in New York City Harbor, where many planes, because it's such a big hub for international flights, refuel. The increase is even more than that. So definitely a lot of headwinds as we head into the summer.
OK, Michelle, thank you very much. Michelle Fleury there for us in New York. Right, let's round up some of the other main business news now. And Israel has signed an historic free trade deal with the United Arab Emirates. It's the first ever it's signed with an Arab country. The deal will see 96% of product duties removed between the two countries. It covers tax rates, imports and intellectual property, and it also removes tariffs on food, agriculture, cosmetics, medical equipment and medicine. Trade between the two countries was worth almost $900 million last year. India's economic growth slowed in the first 3 months of the year as it struggled to deal with soaring inflation. The country's economy expanded by 4.1% between January and March. That is the slowest pace in a year. India has been hit hard by rising oil and commodity prices since Russia invaded Ukraine. The Australian gaming operator Crown Resorts has been fined $57 million for illegally accepting Chinese bank cards at its casino in Melbourne. Regulators say the transactions were falsely classified as hotel services. Crown acknowledged its historic failings and says its top executives were in the process of reforming how the company operates. Right, let's take a look at how the markets are doing. The concerns around the spike in the price of oil has dented investor sentiment, certainly on the continent. You can see the effects of that on the Frankfurt DAX and the Paris CAC. The FTSE 100 benefiting from the jump in the oil price because some of its biggest listed companies are, of course, oil and energy firms, and the higher oil price potentially means bigger profits for them. So that has lifted the overall FTSE 100. All eyes will be on the US markets when they open to see if they can build on that recovery that we saw a little of during the Monday session. That's it for now. I'll see you very soon. Bye-bye.